He had it all, a life many would envy. A man who had survived the pain of losing the woman he loved and built a life once more, this time with a new hope. Jason Corbett, an Irish businessman, a man of strength and ambition, had crossed oceans to start fresh in America. It wasn't the first time tragedy had knocked him down, but it seemed fate had finally given him a chance at happiness once more. In Molly Martens, he found a woman who appeared to be everything he needed. A loving wife, a stepmother to his children, a woman with a smile that seemed to light up the room. Together, they seemed to be the perfect family. But appearances, as they so often do, can be deceiving. Behind the idyllic photos of holidays, family gatherings, and quiet nights together, something darker was at work. Something hidden beneath the surface, hidden from the eyes of those who thought they knew them best. The night of August 2nd, 2015, was the night that shattered everything. A warm summer evening in Lexington, North Carolina, was supposed to be peaceful, tranquil. But in the early hours of the morning, the sound of screams and crashing came from the Corbett home. Jason Corbett's life ended in an unimaginable act of violence, an act that would unravel everything. His body was discovered in his own bedroom, battered beyond recognition. The weapon, a metal baseball bat and a concrete paving brick. His skull crushed, his blood staining the very walls that once held him and his family safe. And standing over him, in the midst of the carnage, his wife, Molly, and her father, Thomas Martens. The story they would tell in the aftermath was one of defense. They claimed it was an act of survival. They claimed that they were trying to protect Molly, that Jason had become violent in a fit of rage, and in that moment, they had no choice but to defend themselves. But the police would find evidence that painted a different picture. The timeline didn't add up. Jason's injuries suggested far more than a sudden act of self-defense. There was blood on the walls, blood that told a story of something far more planned than a quick, spontaneous reaction. As the investigation unfolded, the police dug deeper into Jason's relationship with Molly. What they discovered was far more complex than anyone had realized. Rumors of controlling behavior, jealousy, and manipulation began to surface. And while Jason's death was undeniably brutal, it wasn't just his life that had been destroyed. The children, his two young kids, would be forced to grow up without their father. Caught between two worlds, one that painted Jason as a violent man, the other that begged the question, was there more to this than just self-defense? As the case moved into the courtroom, the world watched closely. The tragedy of Jason Corbett's murder became more than just a local story. It was a case that drew national attention, and with it, a flood of conflicting narratives. Was Jason the victim of an abusive marriage? Or was there something else behind his death, something buried beneath the surface of family secrets and long-held grudges? For those who knew him, Jason Corbett was a man who built his life from nothing, a man who had climbed the ladder of success. Yet, in the end, his rise was met by a tragic fall. The questions mounted as the trial began. What had really happened that night? Who was Jason Corbett in the end? Was he the victim of a terrible accident, or was he the target of something far more calculated? The public would get glimpses of this fractured family, but what they would never fully understand is how it all came to this. What would possess someone to take the life of a man they once loved? What was the catalyst for the violence? Was it really just an act of defense? Or was there something more lurking beneath the surface? Something that was concealed? Something that didn't reveal itself until it was too late? There were other questions that still haunted the case. The children. Jason's own children. The ones who were in the house that night. What had they witnessed? What would they grow up believing? How would they reconcile their father's memory with the events that would forever change their family's future? And then there was Thomas Martens, Molly's father, a retired FBI agent with years of experience in law enforcement. What role did he play? Was he acting as a protective father, or did his own motives cloud his judgment? And why did he, a man trained to investigate crime, participate in this violent act? The case, a complex web of emotion, loss, betrayal, and legal maneuvering, would play out on the world stage. The courtroom would be filled with tension as testimony after testimony was given, each one painting a different version of the truth. In the end, one thing was clear. Jason Corbett's murder would be remembered not just for the brutality of the act, but for the questions it left unanswered. Questions about a love, loyalty, and justice. About the choices we make and the consequences they bring. And as we begin to explore this tragic story, one thing remains certain. The story of Jason Corbett is one that refuses to be forgotten. For the lives it claimed, and for the truths that still remain buried beneath the weight of unanswered questions. This is not just a story about a brutal murder. It is the story of a family torn apart, of a love lost, and of justice still searching for its place in the shadows of what truly happened. Jason Corbett was born in County Limerick, Ireland, in 1973. A small-town boy with big dreams. Growing up in the picturesque Irish countryside, he was no stranger to hard work. The son of a dairy farmer, Jason learned the value of resilience early on. He worked tirelessly, building his reputation in the business world, first as a builder, then as a successful entrepreneur. His ambition drove him forward, and he quickly earned the respect of his community and peers. But life, as it often does, would challenge him in ways he could never have anticipated. In 2006, tragedy struck Jason's life in a way that no one could prepare for. His wife, Margaret Maggs Fitzpatrick, was killed in a car accident. The young couple, only in their early 30s, had 2 children together, a daughter and a son. Margaret's death left Jason shattered. He was forced to pick up the pieces of a broken family and raise their children alone. The love of his life, gone. And with it, his sense of normalcy. Grief, as heavy as the weight of the world, settled over him. For years, Jason struggled with the pain of losing Maggs. He threw himself into his work, trying to bury the sorrow. But the hole she left in his life was impossible to fill. In the years that followed, Jason did his best to keep his family intact. He dedicated himself to raising his children, becoming both a mother and a father to them. It was a task that required endless strength, and while Jason excelled in his work, the pain of losing his first love never truly went away. It wasn't until 2011 that things began to shift. Jason hired a nanny, a young woman named Molly Martens. Molly had come to Ireland from Tennessee looking for a fresh start. She was warm, engaging, and quickly bonded with Jason's children, helping him manage the home and take care of his family while he worked. Over time, what started as a professional relationship began to evolve into something more. Jason, still grieving the loss of his wife, found in Molly a woman who was attentive, caring, and seemingly capable of filling the void that Maggs had left behind. Molly's own story was one of escape, an escape from a troubled past, one that she rarely spoke of but always hinted at. Her father, Thomas Martens, was a retired FBI agent with decades of experience in law enforcement. While he was known to be a calm, methodical man, his presence loomed large in the family dynamic. And yet, it was Molly who took center stage in Jason's world. Jason's life, though still marked by the sorrow of his first wife's death, seemed to take a turn for the better when he and Molly became romantically involved. The two married in 2011, and Jason welcomed Molly into his life and into the lives of his children with open arms. But the story of Jason Corbett is not just one of love and loss. It is a story of complicated relationships, of layers of influence, of a man trying to move forward but constantly pulled back by the shadows of his past. In the years after their marriage, things between Jason and Molly seemed to settle into a routine. They built a life together, moving to North Carolina in 2012, with hopes of a peaceful future. Jason had a promising business venture, and Molly seemed to be adjusting to her new life in America. For all appearances, they were the perfect family. There were family photos from vacations, birthday parties, and quiet afternoons in their home. Jason, with his children, his new wife, and her father, Thomas Martens, all captured in moments of apparent joy. But behind these seemingly perfect moments, a storm was brewing. Molly's relationship with Jason was, according to some, far from ideal. Family members would later speak of growing tensions, quiet rifts that no one outside the family fully understood. Jason, who had been through so much already, tried to hold it all together, hoping that love would overcome any lingering issues. But the cracks in their relationship were beginning to show. Molly had her own struggles, ones that many close to her were reluctant to talk about. But as Jason's life became more entwined with hers, those struggles became his. It seemed that the more they tried to make it work, the more it began to unravel. Though Jason was a successful businessman and had every reason to be hopeful for the future, it was the past that continued to haunt him. The loss of Mags, the struggle to rebuild his family, and now, the deepening complexities of his marriage to Molly. The question that lingered on many minds, including Jason's, was whether his second chance at love was truly the fresh start he had hoped for, or if it was another chapter in a story marked by grief, control, and simmering conflict. And so as we look back at Jason Corbett's life, from his humble beginnings in Ireland to his rise in business and the love that came after tragedy, it's impossible to ignore the darker side of this story. It's a life that, for all its promise, was never fully free from the shadows. Jason Corbett's past wasn't just shaped by loss and love. It was also shaped by those closest to him, people who, despite their best intentions, may have played a part in the story that led to his tragic death. A successful man, a dedicated father, a grieving widower who was trying to rebuild his life, even as the pieces around him seemed to be slipping through his fingers. And yet, despite all his efforts, Jason's story would end in one of the most horrific and tragic ways imaginable. This was not the future he had hoped for. It was a nightmare that no one saw coming. Molly Martens was born in the United States, the daughter of Thomas Martens, a retired FBI agent with an impeccable career in law enforcement. Her upbringing, by all outward appearances, was that of a typical middle-class American family. Her father's steady presence, his calm demeanor, and his strict adherence to structure were evident in the stories Molly would later tell. But beneath the surface of that seemingly well-ordered life, there were darker currents. Molly's childhood was filled with the pressures of living up to the expectations of a father who had seen the worst of humanity in his career. Her family, though outwardly functional, carried unspoken tensions that, over time, would color her own emotional landscape. Though she never spoke of it in public, those close to her knew that Molly had struggled with her mental health for years. The signs were subtle at first. There were mood swings, moments of erratic behavior, and an ever-present sense of anxiety. Her father, a man who had dealt with some of the darkest aspects of human nature, believed that Molly's struggles were simply the result of stress or adolescence. Yet, as time wore on, the cracks in her mental state became harder to ignore. When Molly came to Ireland in 2011 to work as a nanny for Jason Corbett's children, she seemed like the perfect fit, She was warm, engaging, and appeared to offer the stability that Jason needed. After the devastating loss of his first wife, Jason was searching for someone to help him heal, someone who could assist him in raising his children and, perhaps, even help fill the void left by Mags. And Molly, with her bright smile and caring nature, was eager to step in. What started as a professional relationship between Molly and Jason gradually evolved. Their bond deepened, and over time, Jason found in her not just a caretaker for his children, but a partner in life. Despite the lingering grief from his first marriage, Jason opened his heart to Molly. They married in 2011, and together, they moved to North Carolina in 2012, with hopes of building a fresh life away from the memories of Ireland. But the fresh start Jason envisioned was not as smooth as he had hoped. The cultural clash between Jason, an Irishman who had built a life rooted in his home country, and Molly, an American with her own set of expectations and values, became evident soon after they arrived in the States. In Ireland, Jason had been the head of his household, a man who had worked tirelessly to provide for his children and build a successful business. But in North Carolina, he was now faced with a new set of challenges, both professional and personal. Molly, despite her nurturing side, also carried with her an underlying intensity that often clashed with Jason's more laid-back, pragmatic approach to life. The tension between them grew, and the cracks in their marriage began to show. One of the most significant points of conflict arose over parenting. Jason, as a father who had lost his wife and was now raising his children alone, had strong opinions on how to raise them. He wanted them to be disciplined, yet he also wanted them to have the freedom to be children. Molly, however, had different views on parenting. She wanted to create an environment where discipline was enforced, but also where her own authority as a stepmother was unquestioned. The tension between their parenting styles led to frequent arguments that left both of them feeling misunderstood and frustrated. But it wasn't just the parenting disagreements that began to weigh on their relationship. There were fears that had been quietly building in Molly. She feared losing her role in Jason's life, a fear that stemmed from a deep insecurity she had carried with her since childhood. Molly had often been overlooked and neglected in her own family, and as much as she tried to create the perfect family with Jason, a sense of inadequacy began to gnaw at her. In the quiet moments, when Jason was away or occupied with work, Molly's insecurities would take over. She began to fear that Jason, a man who had been so deeply affected by the death of his first wife, would one day see her as a replacement, someone who could never measure up. The pressure of living up to that ideal, being the woman who could fill Mags's shoes, weighed heavily on Molly's mind. Her anxiety grew, and as the months passed, it became clear that her mental state was deteriorating. What had once been a seemingly perfect marriage now felt like a battlefield, with Molly fighting against her own demons and Jason caught in the crossfire. Yet, despite these challenges, they tried to push forward, each of them desperate to make the marriage work. But something was changing. The dynamics between them had shifted. What had started as love, something that had felt so pure and hopeful, was now clouded by doubt and fear. Molly had already begun to distance herself emotionally from Jason, even as she struggled to maintain a facade of normalcy for the sake of their family. She started to see Jason's relationship with his children as a source of rivalry, a competition she could never win. As tensions mounted, so did Molly's desperation. She began to isolate herself from the people around her, including Jason. And though Jason tried to be supportive, he too was feeling the weight of a marriage that was slowly slipping through his fingers. Yet, despite all this, they had the children, their shared responsibility, which kept them tethered together, at least on the surface. And it was these children, Jason's two young kids who were caught in the crossfire of a marriage on the brink. They were witnesses to the growing tension, the arguments, and the unease that permeated their home. The couple was stuck in a vicious cycle. Molly's fears and insecurities drove a wedge between them. Jason's grief over the death of his first wife and his inability to find peace in his second marriage kept him trapped in a state of emotional paralysis. They both wanted a happy ending, but deep down, they both feared it would never come. And, as the months passed, Jason's once bright future began to dim. What had begun as a hopeful journey to America had now become a battleground of love, loss, and unspoken fears. And at the center of it all was a marriage that was slowly unraveling. The threads that once held it together fraying beyond repair. But no one could have predicted just how quickly things would spiral. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface would soon erupt in the most horrific way. The night that Jason Corbett's life would come to a violent end was fast approaching. August 2nd, 2015, the night that forever changed the Corbett family. It began like any other summer evening in Lexington, North Carolina. The house was quiet. Jason Corbett was at home with his wife, Molly, and her father, Thomas Martens. But beneath the surface of this seemingly peaceful night, something far darker was unfolding. At around 2:30 a.m., the tranquility of the night was shattered. A 911 call came into the emergency dispatch center, an urgent cry for help that would later reveal the terrifying events that had just unfolded inside the Corbett home. Molly, on 911 call, I don't know what happened. He's dead. My husband, he's been attacked. Her voice is shaky, her breaths short and fast as she struggles to convey what had just occurred. But the urgency in her voice only raises more questions than answers. What happened? The dispatcher asks. I don't know, Molly replies, still in a state of shock. Seconds later, Thomas Martens, Molly's father, can be heard in the background, speaking frantically as he tries to assist his daughter. The tone of his voice is sharp, demanding, yet there is an underlying calmness, an eerily detached sense of control as he tries to make sense of the chaotic scene unfolding in their home. The 911 call would become one of the key pieces of evidence in the case, offering a glimpse into the confusion and panic that gripped Molly and Thomas Martens in the immediate aftermath of Jason Corbett's brutal death. When police arrived on the scene, they were met with a gruesome and chaotic scene. The home, once a place of safety, was now stained with blood. Inside the bedroom where Jason had been sleeping, investigators found the horrifying evidence of what had occurred. Jason's body was found lying near his bed, his face unrecognizable, crushed by blunt force trauma. The walls of the room were covered in blood, and the floor was slick with it. The murder weapon, a metal baseball bat, lay nearby, covered in Jason's blood. Blunt force trauma had been inflicted to Jason's head and upper body, with the blows so brutal that they left an unmistakable pattern of blood splatter, an indication of how violently he had been attacked. The position of the body suggested that Jason had never had a chance to defend himself, the nature of the wounds indicating a ferocious and calculated assault. It was clear this had not been a spontaneous act of violence. There was an unsettling precision to the brutality, an intentionality that raised more questions than answers. As the investigators pieced together the scene, they also began to focus on the people in the house at the time. Molly and her father, Thomas Martens. Molly and Thomas had both claimed that the attack on Jason had been an act of self-defense. According to their statements, Jason had become violent during the night, and they were forced to defend themselves. But as police began their investigation, discrepancies quickly emerged. Molly's statements were inconsistent. The timeline she provided didn't align with the physical evidence at the scene. The extent of Jason's injuries suggested that the attack had not been a quick, impulsive response to a moment of danger. Instead, it appeared to be an assault that had been carried out over a period of time, a series of brutal blows that left no room for a story of self-defense. Thomas Martens, who had spent his career in law enforcement, appeared remarkably calm in his recounting of the events. His demeanor was cool and measured, as though he had been in situations like this before. But his statements, too, raised questions. The more investigators dug into the details of that night, the more they realized that the version of events provided by Molly and Thomas Martens didn't quite fit. According to their statements, Jason had attacked Molly, but there were no signs of injury on her body to support that claim. The blood spatter at the scene indicated that Jason had been struck while he was still in bed, suggesting he was either asleep or defenseless. The idea of self-defense began to unravel. As police began to question the pair further, it became increasingly clear that there was more to this story than they were telling. Detective interviewing Molly. Tell us again what happened. Walk us through it, step by step. Molly's eyes flicker nervously, her voice shaking as she recounts her version of the events. Her story seems rehearsed, but the lack of emotion in her delivery raises suspicion. Meanwhile, Thomas Martens, with his years of law enforcement experience, answers questions with a calm precision, but there's an air of detachment in his responses, as though he's carefully crafting his own narrative. The longer they spoke, the more questions mounted. What had really happened that night? Was Jason the victim of a tragic misunderstanding, or was this something far more planned, something that had been building for months, even years? The physical evidence didn't support the claim of self-defense. The position of the body, the severity of the injuries, and the weapon used all suggested a much more violent and calculated attack. And then, the shocking truth began to emerge. Molly and her father had been lying. The attack was not the result of a violent outburst from Jason, but rather the culmination of months of mounting tension, jealousy, and insecurity. What had once been a loving relationship had turned into something far darker. What had been an act of supposed defense was now looking more and more like premeditated murder. The tragic events of that night, the bloodshed, the chaos, and the chilling calm of the perpetrators left everyone asking the same question. How far had the darkness in Molly Martens' heart gone? How deep did the manipulation and fear run within this family? And, most chillingly of all, how could something so violent and senseless come from a home that was supposed to be a place of love and safety? As the initial shock of Jason Corbett's death began to fade, the cold light of reality settled in. What had initially seemed like a tragic case of self-defense was now starting to unravel in ways that no one could have predicted. The inconsistencies in the crime scene were impossible to ignore. While Molly and Thomas Martens had insisted that Jason had been the aggressor, the evidence suggested something entirely different. The blood spatter patterns at the scene suggested that Jason had been attacked while he was still in bed, his injuries consistent with someone who had been struck repeatedly while in a vulnerable position. His lack of defensive wounds made it clear Jason had never had a chance to protect himself. The position of the body, too, raised questions. Jason had been found lying in a way that seemed unnatural for someone supposedly defending themselves. There were no signs of struggle, no movement indicating that Jason had fought back. It was as if he had been struck without warning, his life snatched away in an instant. Further investigation revealed that the metal baseball bat, the weapon used in the attack, had been found mere feet from Jason's body, still smeared with blood. But it wasn't just the bat that raised red flags. The crime scene itself appeared staged, as though an attempt had been made to cover up the true nature of the attack. As detectives began to piece together the timeline of events, they found even more troubling discrepancies. The 911 call made by Molly seemed to conflict with the evidence they were uncovering. There were moments in her call when she appeared too calm, too controlled for someone who had just witnessed the brutal murder of her husband. And then there was the matter of her father, Thomas Martens. Law enforcement officials were quick to note the inconsistencies in the statements given by Molly and Thomas. Their calm demeanor, their methodical recounting of events, raised the eyebrows of investigators. It was almost as though they were carefully rehearsing their version of the story. Detectives began questioning their motives, considering whether the Martens family was trying to hide the true nature of the events that night. Neighbors, too, had begun to speak out. One neighbor, who had lived near the Corbett household for several years, recalled hearing strange noises late that night, sounds that did not match the story that had been told by Molly and Thomas. Neighbor, interview footage. I heard shouting, yes, but it wasn't what you would expect in a situation like that. It didn't sound like someone defending themselves. It sounded like a fight, a real confrontation, and I heard something crash, like something heavy hitting the floor. It didn't make sense to me when I heard later that it was self-defense. The suspicions were mounting. What had happened in that house on August 2nd was no longer clear. Was this truly a case of self-defense, as Molly and Thomas had claimed? Or was it something much darker, a carefully executed murder hidden behind the guise of an act of protection? And then came the coroner's report, a document that would prove to be a pivotal piece of evidence. According to the coroner's report, Jason Corbett's death had been caused by blunt force trauma to the head and upper body. The severity of his injuries, multiple strikes to the skull and face, indicated a brutal, sustained attack. The coroner also noted that Jason's time of death had occurred hours before the 911 call was made, suggesting that the violence had begun well before Molly's frantic call to emergency services. The report also detailed the extensive internal damage caused by the blows. Jason's skull had been fractured, and there were deep lacerations on his face. The coroner noted that the degree of trauma was consistent with an attack that had been both violent and deliberate. This was not the reaction of someone defending themselves in a fit of panic. This was calculated. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear Jason Corbett had not died in an act of self-defense. His death was the result of a deliberate and brutal assault, an assault that had been planned or, at the very least, carried out with intent. What had originally appeared to be a moment of desperation was now beginning to look like something much darker. The Martens family's narrative, once presented as an act of self-preservation, was starting to crumble. Law enforcement officials began to zero in on Molly and Thomas, their stories becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile with the physical evidence. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. They were hiding something. As the days passed, investigators began to reframe the case. What had seemed like an unfortunate tragedy now looked more like a carefully executed murder. Was this a case of jealousy, fear, and manipulation? Was it the product of years of unresolved tension, mental health struggles, and an inability to cope with the complexities of life? Or was it something even more chilling, a cold, calculated crime? Each new piece of evidence seemed to point in one direction. Jason Corbett had been the victim of a violent, premeditated attack. But who was truly responsible for his death? And what was the real story behind that fateful night? As investigators prepared to move forward, the tension in the case grew. The truth, whatever it was, out of reach. The Corbett family's version of events had already begun to unravel, but the question remained: how far would those responsible go to protect their secret? And what would happen when the full truth was finally revealed? The investigation into Jason Corbett's brutal murder had brought disturbing truths to light, and now the case would move from the confines of police interviews and forensic reports to the unforgiving spotlight of the courtroom. The question on everyone's mind: who was truly responsible for Jason's death? Was this a tragic case of self-defense gone wrong, or had something far more calculated and sinister occurred? On the 25th of August, 2017, the trial of Molly and Thomas Martens began. It would become a battle not only for justice, but for the truth. A truth that had been obscured by conflicting stories, emotional manipulation, and a mounting sea of evidence that pointed in one direction: murder. As the trial began, both sides were already preparing their strategies. On one side, the prosecution would argue that Jason Corbett's death was the result of a premeditated attack, carefully planned by his wife, Molly, and her father, Thomas Martens. On the other side, the defense would maintain that Molly and Thomas had acted in self-defense, desperate to protect themselves from an unpredictable and violent man. But the evidence, the cold, hard facts, told a very different story. Key evidence was presented that would shape the case. The blood spatter found at the crime scene, showing patterns that suggested Jason had been attacked in his bed while asleep, seemed to directly contradict the defense's claim of self-defense. The lack of defensive wounds on Jason's body raised even more troubling questions. If he had been the aggressor, why had he failed to defend himself? Why had he not fought back? Especially if the assault had taken place in his own home, where he should have been most capable of fighting off an attack. And then there was the baseball bat, the weapon used to strike Jason. Found near his body, it was smeared with his blood, and forensic analysis confirmed it as the weapon that had inflicted the fatal blows. But the placement of the bat at the scene and the force of the blows that had been struck with it painted a chilling picture. Jason had not stood a chance. The prosecution leaned heavily on the physical evidence. Forensic experts testified to the brutal nature of the attack, pointing out the severity of the injuries Jason had sustained, particularly to his skull and face. The coroner's report confirmed that the blows had been inflicted with such force that they could only be described as a violent, deliberate act. Forensic expert: the nature of these injuries, the blunt force trauma to the head, the blood spatter patterns, they tell us that this was not a momentary act of self-defense. This was a sustained attack. Jason Corbett was struck repeatedly while he was in a vulnerable position, likely asleep in bed. The lack of defensive wounds shows that he had no chance to protect himself. The level of violence here is not typical of an act of self-defense. The prosecution's case was clear. This was not a case of a violent man attacking in a fit of rage. Instead, they argued, it was the story of a family's dark secret, a premeditated attack carried out with cold calculation. Jason had not been the aggressor. He had been the victim of a brutal and intentional assault. But the defense was not going to back down so easily. The defense would argue that Molly and Thomas had acted in self-defense. According to their narrative, Jason had been a violent, unstable man who had become abusive over time. They claimed that, fearing for their lives, Molly and her father had been forced to act in defense of themselves when Jason became physically threatening that night. Defense attorney: our clients did not wake up that night thinking they would be forced to defend themselves. Jason Corbett was a man who had a history of outbursts. He was unstable. When Molly and Thomas Martens found themselves in a position where they feared for their lives, they acted to protect themselves. This was not premeditated murder. This was survival in the face of an unpredictable threat. But the jury wasn't so easily swayed. While the defense attempted to frame the incident as an act of self-defense, the mounting evidence pointed to something else entirely. The presence of Jason's family in the courtroom only added to the emotional weight of the trial. His father, brothers, and other family members sat silently in the gallery, watching as the two people responsible for his death faced judgment. Their pain, their loss, was etched on their faces as they listened to the defense's attempts to paint a different picture of Jason, one that was far removed from the loving father and businessman they knew. But despite the defense's attempts to discredit Jason's character, the truth was hard to ignore. Jason's family had lost a son, a brother, and a father, and they knew the man they loved was not the violent monster the defense sought to portray. As the trial progressed, the evidence continued to mount against Molly and Thomas Martens. The blood spatter, the baseball bat, the lack of defensive wounds, and the testimony from forensic experts all pointed to a clear conclusion. Jason Corbett's death had been an act of calculated violence, not a desperate act of self-defense. When the jury finally returned with their verdict, it was clear that justice would not be denied. Molly Martens and Thomas Martens were found guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Jason Corbett. The courtroom erupted in emotion as the verdict was read, a bittersweet moment for Jason's family, who had waited so long for the truth to come to light. Molly Martens was sentenced to 20 to 25 years in prison, while Thomas Martens was sentenced to a minimum of 20 years in prison for his role in the murder. It was a verdict that brought no true closure, no solace. Jason Corbett was gone, his life brutally cut short. His family, forever scarred by the loss of a beloved father, brother, and husband, could now only try to heal from the tragedy that had consumed their lives. The trial had been long and emotional. Every day had brought new revelations, painful confrontations, and overwhelming evidence that had led to one undeniable truth. Jason Corbett had been brutally murdered. The question that remained was not what had happened. That had become painfully clear, but who would be held accountable for the life that had been taken? As the final day of the trial arrived, the jury was tasked with delivering a decision that would change the lives of everyone involved forever. The jury deliberated for hours, the weight of their decision heavy on their shoulders. The evidence was irrefutable. The blood spatter, the brutal injuries, the lack of defensive wounds. The prosecution had shown that Jason's death was not a tragic accident, nor was it a case of self-defense. It had been an act of premeditated violence, an attack carried out with deliberate intent. The defense had painted a different picture, claiming that Molly and Thomas Martens had acted out of fear, defending themselves against an unpredictable and violent man. But as the jury sifted through the evidence, the truth became undeniable. The question was no longer whether Jason Corbett's life had been taken from him in cold blood. The question now was whether Molly and Thomas Martens would be held accountable for that brutality. When the jury returned, the tension in the courtroom reached its breaking point. All eyes were on the judge, and all ears strained to hear the words that would bring the long trial to its heartbreaking conclusion. The verdict was read aloud. Both Molly Martens and Thomas Martens were found guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Jason Corbett. The courtroom erupted in emotion, but it was not the relief that many had hoped for. Jason's family, who had sat through every gut-wrenching moment of the trial, could not hide the mixture of anger and sorrow on their faces. For them, no verdict could ever bring back Jason or ease the immense pain of their loss. But the conviction, at the very least, was a form of justice. For Jason's family, the moment was one of bittersweet victory. The verdict brought no true comfort. The emptiness of his absence remained, a gaping wound that could never heal. His children, his father, his siblings, all of them had been left behind to grapple with a loss that could never be truly filled. And then, there were the Martens family members. Molly Martens sat in the courtroom, her face a mask of emotion. Her expression was a mix of disbelief and something harder to define. Beside her, Thomas Martens looked distant, almost detached. Despite the emotional outpouring from Jason's family, the Martens family seemed almost numbed by the weight of the guilty verdict. The long road to justice had come to an end, but their journey, one of guilt, blame, and punishment, had just begun. The courtroom was now divided, but the next stage of this nightmare was about to unfold: sentencing. The guilty verdict had been rendered, but now the court would determine just how long Molly and Thomas Martens would pay for their crimes. Both Molly and Thomas Martens were sentenced to 20 to 25 years in prison for their roles in the brutal murder of Jason Corbett. The sentences were handed down with little ceremony, but the impact was far from small. For Molly Martens, the sentence would mean decades in prison. A life once full of promise and potential had now been irrevocably altered by one act of violence. She would never again experience the freedom she once had, the life she had built with Jason, the life she had once hoped to have with her new family. Thomas Martens, too, faced his own reckoning. His sentence was no less than the one handed down to his daughter, and though he seemed less visibly affected than Molly, the weight of his conviction would follow him for the rest of his life. For Jason's family, the sentencing marked the end of a long and exhausting journey. The justice they had sought was now in the hands of the courts. Yet, despite the verdict, the scars of this tragedy would never fade. Their brother, son, and father was gone, and no amount of legal justice could bring him back. In contrast, the Martens family would now have to confront the consequences of their actions. The sentence was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was the price to be paid for a life taken in the most violent and heartless of ways. Molly and Thomas Martens had to face the reality of their involvement in Jason Corbett's death. The future for them would be one spent in prison, a stark contrast to the life they had once known. The trial, the conviction, the sentencing, it was all over now. But for those who loved Jason Corbett, the wounds would never truly heal. His life was cut short in the most brutal of ways, and in the end, all that was left was a question that would never be fully answered. Why? Why did it have to end this way? The journey toward justice for Jason Corbett seemed to take another unexpected turn in 2020, when the unthinkable happened. The conviction of Molly and Thomas Martens was overturned. What had once been a story of a brutal murder, a guilty verdict, and a sense of finality that long-awaited justice was now overshadowed by procedural issues that would lead to a shocking legal twist. In 2020, the North Carolina Court of Appeals ruled that the conviction of Molly and Thomas Martens was to be overturned due to procedural errors in the original trial. The defense had raised issues with the handling of evidence, legal technicalities that would ultimately result in the court's decision. For Jason's family, the ruling was a crushing blow. The sense of justice they had clung to since the guilty verdict was now in jeopardy, and the idea that the trial, a trial they had believed would bring finality, had been compromised by legal oversights, was an unbearable reality. The decision sent shockwaves through the community, leaving a deep sense of unease. For the Martens family, this was a moment of cautious hope, a chance for a new legal fight, one that could ultimately restore their freedom. But for Jason's loved ones, this felt like a reopening of old wounds, a second chance for the accused, and a heartbreaking reminder of their loss. The decision to overturn the conviction sparked intense debate across the country, but it was in Ireland, where Jason had been born and raised, that the anger was most palpable. Jason's family and many others felt as if the system that had once condemned Molly and Thomas Martens had now failed them once more. In Ireland, public outrage mounted. Many saw the overturning of the conviction as a miscarriage of justice. Jason Corbett's family felt betrayed, as though the law, which had once given them hope, was now failing them again. The case had become not just a local tragedy, but a symbol of something larger, the system's potential failure to deliver true justice. But the story was far from over. In 2023, after years of legal battles and public outcry, the case took yet another turn. Molly Martens and Thomas Martens entered an Alford plea. This legal maneuver allowed them to accept punishment without a It was a shocking resolution, one that seemed to sidestep the truth of what had happened that fateful night in 2015. By entering the Alford plea, the Martens were able to avoid a retrial, but they also faced a reduced sentence. The charges against them were lessened, and instead of serving decades behind bars, their sentences were significantly reduced. The time they had already served in prison was factored in, and they were ultimately sentenced to time served and probation. For many, this was a bitter pill to swallow. The Alford plea allowed the Martens to avoid any further admission of guilt, even as they accepted the consequences of their actions. But, for Jason's family and supporters, this was nothing short of a betrayal. Molly and Thomas Martens had been convicted of second-degree murder in the death of Jason Corbett, but the system now seemed to offer them a second chance, an opportunity to walk free after having taken the life of a man in the most brutal of ways. The public reaction was swift and furious, particularly in Ireland, where the story had captured hearts across the nation. Jason's family could not understand how this could be allowed to happen. They had watched as their loved one's life had been taken in the most violent of circumstances. They had waited for justice, for a verdict that would honor Jason's memory and bring closure to the pain of his brutal death. But the legal twists, the overturned conviction, the Alford plea, it all felt like a betrayal. As Jason's family struggled with their grief, they found themselves grappling not only with the loss of their loved one, but with a sense of helplessness against a system that seemed to place more value on legal technicalities than on the brutal truth of what had happened. The Alford plea had become a symbol of the complicated, frustrating nature of justice, a system that could sometimes appear to be more focused on its own intricacies than on delivering true closure for the victims and their families. For Jason's loved ones, the legal maneuver felt like a slap in the face. As Molly and Thomas Martens walked free, having served their time in prison, the question lingered in the air. Was this justice? Or was it merely another legal technicality that had allowed two people to escape full accountability for the life they had taken? The murder of Jason Corbett had forever changed the lives of those who loved him. And though the legal battle had seemingly come to an end, the scars of this tragedy would never fade. The journey for justice, it seemed, would remain an ongoing, painful struggle. The tragedy of Jason Corbett's death wasn't just a loss for his family. It was a trauma that would forever shape the lives of his two young children, Jack and Sarah. In the wake of their father's brutal murder, they were forced to navigate a world that no child should ever have to experience. A world where their lives were turned upside down, their sense of security shattered, and their innocence stolen. The days and weeks that followed Jason's death were marked by unimaginable trauma for his children. The horrifying events of that night were burned into their memories, their lives forever altered. Jason's family, particularly his sister, Tracy Corbett, would now be tasked with protecting them, offering them the stability and care they desperately needed in the wake of such an unthinkable loss. Jack and Sarah were placed under the care of their aunt, Tracy, who was awarded full custody. She stepped into the role of mother, a role she never imagined she would have to take on under such tragic circumstances. As the legal battle over their father's death raged on, the children's well-being remained the center of the storm. In court, the focus shifted away from the murder and toward the future of Jason's children. The court recognized the importance of placing them with someone who could offer them the love and protection they needed. Tracy, Jason's sister, became their legal guardian. But despite the tragedy, despite the overwhelming support of Jason's family, one figure loomed large in the children's lives: Molly Martens. Molly Martens, Jason's widow, fought fiercely to remain in her children's lives. Despite her conviction for murder, she had not been stripped of all rights as a parent. And so, she made attempts to gain contact with the children, to regain custody, or at the very least, visitation rights. Her motives, though, were met with intense suspicion. To the Corbett family, and to many others, the idea of Molly reconnecting with the children was anathema. She had played a central role in Jason's death. Could a mother who had been part of such a brutal act truly be trusted with the care of his children? The emotional scars that Jack and Sarah carried were far too deep to simply be ignored. How could they ever feel safe with the woman who had taken their father's life? Tracy Corbett, as the children's legal guardian, made it her life's mission to protect them from further trauma. In interviews, she spoke candidly about the difficulty of the situation, about the love she had for her niece and nephew, and her commitment to giving them a life that was as normal as possible. The bond between them grew stronger with each passing day as she worked tirelessly to shield them from the horrors of their past. But Molly's legal battles were not over. She continued to press for some form of contact with the children, a move that sparked anger and concern among those who had watched her role in the events that led to Jason's death. The question remained, could a convicted murderer truly be entrusted with the care of innocent children? For Jason's family, the thought of Molly having any involvement in the children's lives was heartbreaking. They saw in the children's eyes the remnants of the trauma they had suffered, and the idea that they might once again be exposed to the very person who had caused their father's death was unfathomable. In statements and interviews, Jason's relatives shared their fears, expressing their dedication to giving the children the love and safety they deserved. "We've lost so much," Jason's sister Tracy said in one interview, "but I will make sure these children never lose their future." In the months and years that followed, Jack and Sarah began to heal. They found comfort in the stability that Tracy and her family provided. With each passing day, they were able to rebuild their lives. They were no longer the victims of a nightmare that seemed to stretch endlessly before them. They were children again, given the chance to find joy, to laugh, and to dream, things that had seemed so impossible after that terrible night. Though their future would forever carry the scars of their father's death, they were able to grow up in a home filled with love and care, a place where their father's memory could live on, but not as a symbol of pain, but as a symbol of the strength and resilience of their family. The journey for Jack and Sarah Corbett was long and painful, but it was not without hope. They were able to move forward, not just as survivors of an unimaginable tragedy, but as children who had been given a second chance to live, to love, and to grow, all thanks to the tireless efforts of their aunt, Tracy, who had stepped into a role no one should have to take on. In the end, the children's story was not just one of loss, but of survival, resilience, and the power of family. As the final chapter of Jason Corbett's story unfolds, one thing remains undeniably clear. The journey toward justice has been anything but straightforward. It has been marked by heartbreak, legal battles, and a series of twists and turns that left his family and the world questioning the very nature of justice. From the brutal night of his death to the courtroom drama that followed, The story of Jason's murder has never been just a story of loss. It is a tale of a family left shattered, a man whose life was taken too soon, and a system that, at times, seemed more focused on legal technicalities than delivering true justice. For Jason's family, the question remains, was this truly justice? Jason's family watched in disbelief as the legal system, which they had placed so much faith in, failed to provide the closure they so desperately needed. The overturned conviction in 2020, the Alford plea in 2023, these events left Jason's loved ones with a profound sense of injustice. How could a man be brutally killed in his own home, and yet those responsible seem to escape full accountability? There is a deep and painful irony in the way this case has unfolded. Though the Martens family's legal battles were relentless, Jason's family was left to fight a different, more personal battle. One for the memory of a man who deserved to be remembered not for his death, but for the life he lived. Jason Corbett was not just a man lost to violence. He was a father, a brother, a friend. A man who had built a life in Ireland, had lost a wife, and bravely moved forward with the help of a woman he thought he could trust. He was a man who worked tirelessly for the family he loved, who dreamed of a better future for his children. And while his life was tragically cut short, his legacy lives on in the hearts of those who loved him. In his children, who, despite everything, continue to move forward. In the efforts of his sister Tracy, who fought for their future, who ensured they were safe and loved. The questions, however, remain. Why was Jason's life taken in such a brutal and senseless manner? Was it truly an act of self-defense, as claimed by the accused? Or was it something darker, a cold-blooded murder disguised as a defense? And perhaps most haunting of all, why does it seem that in the end, the justice system failed to deliver the accountability that Jason's family sought? These are questions that may never be fully answered. They are questions that will linger in the minds of those who followed this case closely. But one thing is certain, Jason Corbett's story is not just a story of violence and betrayal. It is a story of survival, of resilience, and of love. It is a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable grief, there are those who will fight to ensure that justice, in whatever form it may take, is served. In the end, Jason's legacy is more than just a tragic story. It's a testament to the strength of those who loved him. His family, his friends, and the children he left behind. His story is one of pain, yes, but also one of hope and endurance. And perhaps, in remembering him, we can honor his life in the way it was meant to be remembered, not as a victim of a crime, but as a man who had a family who loved him, who fought for justice, and who, in the end, found peace. If you found this story compelling, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below with your thoughts. We want to hear from you. Share your perspectives, your thoughts on justice, and your reflections on this tragic case. And as always, thank you for joining us in exploring the truth behind one of America's most heartbreaking tragedies.